What does it mean to be a man today? Think about that question for a moment. In a world that seems to be redefining masculinity every decade, we're left with conflicting ideas of what it means to embody strength, purpose, and virtue. On one side, we're told to embrace our emotions, to be vulnerable, to reject the old stereotypes of stoicism and dominance. On the other side, we're told to man up, to lead, to protect, to conquer. And somewhere in the middle of all this noise, countless men are left feeling lost, unsure of who they are or who they're supposed to be. Here's the problem: modern masculinity has become a battlefield of extremes. One side dismisses the traditional archetypes, labeling them as toxic relics of a bygone era. The other clings to them, doubling down on outdated ideals that no longer fit the complexities of modern life. And caught in this tug of war are real men, real people who are struggling to find their place in a world that keeps shifting beneath their feet. But what if this isn't just a modern problem? What if the struggle to define masculinity has always been there, hidden beneath the surface of society's changing values? Friedrich Nietzsche, one of history's most provocative philosophers, believed that humanity's greatest struggles often came from losing touch with its deeper virtues. And when we talk about masculinity today, it's clear that something has been lost, not just for men, but for everyone. Nietzsche didn't write specifically about masculinity, but his ideas about strength, will, and virtue offer us something powerful. He challenged the assumptions of his time, rejecting the rigid moral codes and societal norms that he believed were suffocating the human spirit. He argued that true strength isn't about dominance or control, it's about becoming who you are. It's about creating your own values, your own purpose, instead of blindly following the expectations of others. So let's ask a question that cuts to the heart of this discussion: is modern masculinity failing men because it's built on values that no longer serve them? And if that's true, what new values should take their place?
Click subscribe to this channel to get more profound insights.
Let's start with the idea of strength. It's one of the oldest pillars of masculinity, but what does it actually mean to be strong? For centuries, strength was tied to physical power, being able to fight, to hunt, to protect. But in today's world, where survival doesn't depend on brute force, that definition feels incomplete. And yet we still cling to it in subtle ways. Men are told to be tough, to suppress their emotions, to never show weakness. Nietzsche would have called this a form of weakness, not strength. He believed that true strength comes from embracing the chaos within you, not suppressing it. He wrote, "You must have chaos within you to give birth to a dancing star." In other words, the path to greatness isn't found in denying your vulnerabilities, it's found in confronting them, wrestling with them, and transforming them into something meaningful. But here's where modern masculinity often gets it wrong. In rejecting the old archetype of stoic strength, many men have swung to the opposite extreme, believing that vulnerability is enough on its own. It's not. Vulnerability is just the beginning. It's the starting point for growth, not the end goal. Nietzsche would argue that we need to take it a step further. We need to take the raw material of our struggles, our fears, our insecurities, our failures, and use it to create something new. That's where true strength lies. Let's think about this in practical terms. Imagine a man who's struggling to find purpose in his life. He feels stuck, unmotivated, unsure of what direction to take. Society might tell him to follow his passion or just be himself, but those platitudes don't offer any real guidance. Nietzsche would tell him something different. He would say, "Your life is your responsibility. No one is coming to save you. If you want meaning, you have to create it. If you want purpose, you have to build it." This is where Nietzsche's concept of the Übermensch comes in. The Übermensch, or overman isn't about being superior to others, it's about being superior to your former self. It's about rising above the values and limitations you've inherited from society and creating your own path. And isn't that what so many men are craving today? Not a return to outdated ideals, but a way to forge their own identity in a world that no longer provides clear answers. But this isn't easy. Nietzsche didn't believe in shortcuts. He believed that growth requires struggle, that greatness demands sacrifice. And this is another place where modern masculinity often falls short. We live in a culture that avoids discomfort at all costs. We want the rewards without the effort, the results without the process. But Nietzsche would argue that the process is the whole point. Without struggle, there's no growth. Without failure, there's no learning. So here's a question we all need to ask. What are you willing to struggle for? What are you willing to sacrifice in order to become the person you want to be? This brings us to another key aspect of masculinity: virtue. In the past, virtue was tied to specific roles, being a provider, a protector, a leader. But in a world where those roles are no longer as rigid, what does virtue look like for men today? Nietzsche believed that virtue isn't about following a set of rules, it's about living authentically. It's about being true to your values, even when it's hard. But how do you define your values in a world that's constantly pulling you in different directions? Social media tells you to be successful. Advertisers tell you to be desirable. Self-help gurus tell you to be happy. And in the middle of all this noise, it's easy to lose sight of what actually matters to you. Nietzsche would say that the first step is to stop listening to the crowd. He warned against what he called the herd mentality, the tendency to follow the masses instead of thinking for yourself. He believed that most people are content to live shallow, unexamined lives, chasing after comfort and conformity instead of pursuing something deeper. And if you want to live a life of virtue, you have to break away from that. You have to stop looking for validation from the outside world and start looking within. But this doesn't mean isolating yourself or rejecting society altogether. Nietzsche wasn't a nihilist. He didn't believe that life was meaningless. He believed that meaning comes from action, from creating something that reflects your values. And for men, this means asking some hard questions. What kind of man do you want to be? What kind of legacy do you want to leave behind? What are you willing to stand for, even when it's unpopular? These aren't easy questions to answer, and they're not supposed to be. Nietzsche believed that the hardest questions are the ones that lead to the greatest growth. But here's the thing: you don't have to have all the answers right away. It's not about figuring everything out at once, it's about taking the first step. It's about committing to the process, even when it's uncertain, even when it's uncomfortable. So let's bring this back to the original question: is modern masculinity failing men? Maybe it is. Maybe the problem isn't that masculinity is inherently flawed, but that we've lost sight of what it really means. Masculinity, like any human construct, isn't static. It evolves, it changes. And right now we're in a moment of transition, a moment where the old definitions no longer fit, but the new ones haven't fully emerged. But this doesn't have to be a crisis. It can be an opportunity. An opportunity to redefine masculinity on our own terms, to create a version of it that's rooted in strength, virtue, and authenticity. And this brings us to the next part of the conversation. What does it mean to live with purpose in a world that feels increasingly chaotic? How do we take Nietzsche's lessons and apply them to the challenges of modern life? Becoming the Übermensch: how men can create meaning in a chaotic world. Let's pick up where we left off. If modern masculinity is failing, then the question isn't just why, but what now? What do men do in a world where the traditional markers of masculinity, provider, protector, Leaders don't fit as neatly as they once did. How do they find purpose in a time when the rules are unclear, when the expectations are conflicting, and when the values they grew up with seem to have been swept aside? Nietzsche believed that the loss of traditional values wasn't just a problem, it was an opportunity. He called this the death of God, not to focus on religion itself, but as a metaphor for the collapse of the old moral systems that gave people a sense of meaning. For Nietzsche, this wasn't the end, it was a beginning. It was the chance to rebuild meaning from the ground up, to create something stronger, something personal, something real. So let's bring it back to masculinity. What if the problem isn't that the old ideals have faded, but that men haven't yet replaced them with something better? What if the void modern men are feeling isn't a lack of masculinity, but a lack of clarity about what masculinity could mean in this new world? Nietzsche's idea of the Übermensch gives us a clue. The Übermensch isn't about being better than others, it's about becoming the fullest version of yourself. It's about rejecting the values that no longer serve you and creating your own. But this doesn't mean inventing values out of thin air. It means taking a hard look at yourself and asking, what do you care about? What do you stand for? What are you willing to struggle for, even when it's hard, even when it's lonely, even when no one is watching? And here's the uncomfortable truth: no one can tell you the answer. There's no checklist for how to be a man, no universal blueprint to follow. And that's terrifying, isn't it? It's so much easier when someone else gives you the rules, when society hands you a script to follow. But Nietzsche would argue that real growth only happens when you throw away the script. Think about the men you admire most, not the ones society tells you to admire, but the ones who've genuinely earned your respect. What makes them stand out? It's not that they fit some cookie-cutter mold of masculinity. It's that they've built their lives around something meaningful. They've chosen their struggles. They've made hard decisions. They've taken responsibility for who they are. This is what Nietzsche meant by becoming who you are. It's not a passive process. It's not about waiting for life to hand you a purpose. It's about creating that purpose through your actions, your choices, your relationships. But let's be real, this isn't easy. It's messy. It's uncomfortable. It means facing parts of yourself you'd rather avoid. It means admitting that you don't have all the answers, that you're flawed, that you've made mistakes. But that's the point. Nietzsche believed that real strength doesn't come from avoiding struggle, it comes from embracing it. He wrote, "What does not kill me makes me stronger," and while that phrase has been overused to the point of cliché, its meaning is still profound. Strength isn't about avoiding pain. It's about using pain as a tool for growth. So let's make this practical. If modern masculinity is failing men, then the solution isn't to wait for society to fix it. The solution is for men to take responsibility for their own growth. And that starts with asking some direct questions. What kind of man do you want to be? Not what kind of man society expects you to be, or what kind of man your parents wanted you to be, or what kind of man your friends think you should be. Who do you want to be when all the noise fades away? And here's the second question: what are you willing to sacrifice to become that man? Because let's be honest, growth isn't free. It costs something. It costs time, effort, comfort. It costs letting go of habits, relationships, and beliefs that no longer serve you. Nietzsche understood this. He believed that the highest form of life wasn't about comfort or happiness, it was about striving. He called this the will to power, but don't confuse that with a desire for control or domination. The will to power is about self-overcoming. It's about pushing past your limits, not because someone else is forcing you to, but because you've chosen to. Let's take this idea into the real world. Imagine a man who wants to be a better father. He grew up with a distant dad and doesn't have a clear model for what fatherhood should look like. Society gives him conflicting messages: be strong, but also be nurturing. Be a leader, but also be a partner. It's overwhelming. But instead of getting stuck in that confusion, he decides to create his own model. He commits to being present for his kids, even when it's inconvenient. He commits to listening, even when he doesn't have the answers. He commits to showing love, even when it feels awkward or unfamiliar. And in doing so, he creates something powerful, something that wasn't handed to him, but that he built himself. Or think about a man who's struggling in his career. He's stuck in a job that pays the bills but doesn't feel meaningful. He could stay where he is, playing it safe, avoiding risk. But instead, he chooses to take a chance. He starts a business, or switches fields, or goes back to school. It's scary. He fails more than once. But those failures aren't the end, they're part of the process. They're the chaos he needs to create something better. Nietzsche would call this process becoming. It's not about reaching a final destination, it's about constantly growing, constantly striving, constantly creating. And isn't that what masculinity should be about? Not fitting into a box, but breaking out of it. Not living by someone else's values, but building your own. But here's where it gets tricky. If you're going to create your own values, you have to take responsibility for them. You can't blame society or your upbringing or the people around you. You have to own your choices, your actions, your life. This is hard. It's easier to point fingers to say, I'm this way because of my circumstances, but Nietzsche would argue that circumstances are just the starting point. What matters is what you do with them. So let's ask another question. What are you doing with the life you've been given? Are you coasting, following the path of least resistance, or are you actively shaping your life into something meaningful? This isn't about perfection. Nietzsche didn't believe in perfection. He believed in progress, in striving, in becoming. He believed that life isn't about avoiding failure, it's about learning from it. And this brings us to the heart of the issue. Modern masculinity isn't failing men because men are failing. It's failing because it's focused on the wrong things. It's focused on appearances instead of substance. It's focused on fitting in instead of standing out. It's focused on avoiding discomfort instead of embracing growth. But this can change. Masculinity doesn't have to be a rigid set of rules. It can be a process, a journey, a creation. And that creation starts with you, with your choices, your struggles, your values. Now let's take this one step further. Nietzsche believed that the individual isn't separate from the world, they shape it. So if masculinity is going to evolve, it's not just about individual men, it's about how we, as a society, redefine what it means to be strong, to be virtuous, to be human. Is modern masculinity failing men? Nietzsche's lessons on virtue. Let's go deeper. If modern masculinity is to be rebuilt, it won't happen by accident. It requires deliberate effort. And that effort starts with recognizing that masculinity, like any concept, must be dynamic. It must adapt to the world without losing its core. The problem we face today is that masculinity is stuck between nostalgia for a time when roles seemed clearer and a future that's yet to define what men can or should be. Nietzsche understood the danger of clinging to the past. He warned against what he called slave morality, the tendency to hold onto values that no longer empower us, values that keep us small, reactive, and dependent. For masculinity, this means rejecting the idea that strength is about domination, that power is about control, and that vulnerability is inherently weak. At the same time, he would argue against throwing out the old entirely. The past holds wisdom, lessons, and virtues that remain relevant. The challenge is to take what is useful and discard what no longer serves. One of Nietzsche's most famous ideas is the concept of amor fati, or the love of one's fate. It's the idea that instead of resisting the circumstances life gives you, you embrace them fully, even the difficult ones. Imagine looking at every failure, every rejection, every moment of doubt and saying, "This is part of my story. I wouldn't be who I am without it." Modern masculinity could learn from this. Instead of seeing change as a threat, it could embrace it as an opportunity, a way to become stronger, more adaptive, more resilient. Let's talk about resilience for a moment. It's one of the most undervalued aspects of masculinity today. Strength is often portrayed as the ability to avoid breaking, but real strength is the ability to rebuild after you've been broken. Think about the men you know who have faced incredible hardships: a divorce, a career collapse, a personal loss, and come out the other side. What makes them admirable isn't that they avoided pain, it's that they endured it, learned from it, and used it to grow. Nietzsche believed that suffering was essential to growth. He wrote, "To live is to suffer. To survive is to find some meaning in the suffering." This doesn't mean seeking out pain for its own sake. It means recognizing that struggle is a natural part of life and using it as fuel to create something meaningful. Modern masculinity often fails men because it either glorifies struggle in a toxic way, telling men to tough it out, without addressing the root cause, or avoids it altogether, leaving men unprepared for life's challenges. The middle path is where the opportunity lies. It's not about ignoring pain or wallowing in it, it's about transforming it. Think about the Japanese art of kintsugi, where broken pottery is repaired with gold. The cracks aren't hidden, they're highlighted, celebrated, turned into something beautiful. Masculinity could adopt this mindset. Instead of hiding its cracks, its vulnerabilities, it could wear them proudly as signs of growth, strength, and humanity. But how do we actually do this? How do we create a version of masculinity that's both strong and compassionate, both resilient and vulnerable? It starts with redefining what we mean by strength. Strength isn't about being unshakable, it's about being adaptable. It's about bending without breaking, about finding a way forward even when the path isn't clear. For many men, this means letting go of the fear of failure. Failure isn't the opposite of success, it's part of it. Nietzsche would argue that failure is one of life's greatest teachers, but you have to be willing to face it. Too many men are paralyzed by the fear of not measuring up, of being judged, of falling short. But what if failure wasn't something to avoid? What if it was the thing that propelled you forward? Think about the people who inspire you. Are they perfect? Or are they the ones who faced adversity, made mistakes, and come back stronger? The truth is, we don't admire people for being flawless, we admire them for being real. And that's what modern masculinity needs more of: realness. But being real requires courage. It means admitting when you don't have the answers, when you're struggling, when you need help. This goes against everything many men were taught growing up. Vulnerability was seen as weakness, something to hide or suppress. But Nietzsche would argue the opposite. He believed that embracing your flaws, your struggles, and your chaos is what makes you powerful. Let's tie this back to how men relate to each other. One of the biggest failures of modern masculinity is the isolation it creates. Men are often taught to compete with each other, to hide their emotions, to avoid showing weakness. But this leads to loneliness, to shallow connections, to a lack of real support. Nietzsche's idea of the Übermensch isn't about going it alone, it's about creating values that uplift not just yourself, but the people around you. Imagine what masculinity could look like if men supported each other instead of competing. If they built each other up instead of tearing each other down. If they created spaces where they could be honest about their struggles without fear of judgment. This isn't just idealism, it's practical. Men who feel supported are better partners, better fathers, better leaders, and that ripple effect benefits everyone. But let's not ignore the elephant in the room. Masculinity has been criticized a lot in recent years, often for good reason. Toxic behaviors, violence, entitlement, emotional repression have caused real harm. But throwing out masculinity entirely isn't the answer. The solution isn't to reject masculinity, it's to evolve it. To take the parts that serve us strength, resilience, courage, and combine them with the parts we've neglected: vulnerability, compassion, connection. This evolution won't happen overnight. It's a process, and like any process, it requires effort. It requires men to take responsibility for their own growth, to step out of their comfort zones, and to challenge the narratives they've been given. But it also requires society to create spaces for that growth. Men can't evolve in isolation. They need support, mentorship, and opportunities to redefine what masculinity means in a way that's authentic to them. So where does this leave us? Masculinity isn't failing because men are weak, it's failing because the old definitions no longer fit. But this isn't the end of masculinity. It's a chance to rebuild it into something stronger, something wiser, something more human. Nietzsche believed that the greatest human achievements come from struggle. And right now, masculinity is struggling. But that struggle isn't something to fear, it's something to embrace. Because within it lies the opportunity to create a version of masculinity that's not just relevant to the modern world, but essential to it. So the real question isn't whether modern masculinity is failing men. The question is, what are men willing to do about it? Are they willing to face the discomfort, the uncertainty, the chaos of redefining themselves? Are they willing to reject the values that no longer serve them and create their own? This isn't a task for someone else. It's not up to society or women or institutions to fix masculinity. It's up to men. It's up to you. And here's what's at stake: not just the future of masculinity, but the future of humanity. Because when men are strong in the truest sense of the word, when they're resilient, compassionate, courageous, and connected, everyone benefits. Nietzsche believed that greatness comes from self-overcoming. If modern masculinity is going to survive, it must overcome itself. And if men are willing to do that work, to face their flaws, to embrace their chaos, to rebuild their values, then masculinity won't just survive, it will thrive. And in the end, isn't that what we all want? Not perfection, but progress. Not rigid roles, but real connection. Not the masculinity of the past, but a masculinity that's strong enough to carry us into the future.